I'm talking about some work that I did with my colleague Erin Sherry in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to just say a little bit about rural development and policy in the north, which I think is pretty similar actually to the rest of Europe. I'll talk about the Rural Needs Act and I'll make some comments and observations. So here's my map showing you this little yellow component at the top of Ireland, which is Northern Ireland. And before Brexit and the protocol agreement, I think a lot of people didn't even know it was there, but suddenly most people do. So it's a very small region. It's a population of about 1.6 million. Most of it is urban adjacent. You know, you really don't have remote rural in Northern Ireland. It's a small region. Similar to the rest of Europe, the first rural development program was introduced because of Europe. You know, the Department of Agriculture became the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. And I think this in itself is quite an important point, you know, because I remember interviewing people in the Department of Agriculture who said, we were the Department of Agriculture, we got rural development, we'd no idea what to do with it. And they were saying in the 2000s, they still had no idea what to do with it. So where that responsibility for rural sits is an interesting question, because it's usually with agriculture, and that's because rural was attached to agriculture in European policy. Like everybody else, they were running the LEADER program. It was really important for rural communities and has been. The LEADER program is really successful. And we have so many examples of how innovative it has allowed communities to be. In Northern Ireland from the outset, there was a very strong emphasis on rural poverty and disadvantage. It came on the back of a rural poverty program, and that's always been the defining feature of it, although that's pretty true of England as well. So if you like, in the 90s, it was about the rural development program, which in some ways makes sense. The Department of Agriculture actually had the policy tools and responsibility for that program. In the 2000s, like lots of places, it moved from the rural development program to rural policy more generally. And then it gets really messy, because then of course you're getting into housing, hospitals, a whole breadth of services that this one government department doesn't have responsibility for. Northern Ireland has always been pretty progressive actually around rural. They fund rural women's networks. They funded quite a generous rural childcare program. They fund various rural poverty initiatives. And then they introduced rural proofing, pretty much aping England. I mean, and you have to remember, you didn't have a devolved government. Northern Ireland wasn't used to making its own policies. So it always tended to kind of ape England. So it introduced the first program in 2002, similar to England, and I was involved in a call recently about this with somebody from the House of Lords who has been involved in reinvigorating rural in England, tends to be enhanced and so on coming up to elections. So it becomes a kind of election call to bring in rural votes. And that's happened as well in Northern Ireland, culminating in the introduction of legislation. So the Rural Needs Act was introduced in 2016. And even that terminology is interesting because it's very much premised on need, on disadvantage. And this is a busy slide. I'm not going to talk through it all, but it requires departments and local government and non-departmental bodies to have due regard to rural need. Now, Erin and I interviewed all these various people involved in implementing it, as well as people in the department. So they must have due regard, they must report on how rural needs are addressed. And then the department must review to ensure that the bodies have reported. And if needed, they can provide guidance and advice although to my knowledge, this has never happened. So, rural need isn't defined, and this became an issue. What's the difference between something that's needed and something that's desired? So you might want a local school, but we spoke to people in the Department of Education who said that often with rural schools, when they're very small and poorly resourced, better off parents are leapfrogging that school and driving their kids to the better school. And actually, it would better serve the rural community to close the school and then be obliged to bus everyone to the next school, which might not be an option for some poorer families. So what is a need, and what is a want? And what about monitoring and reporting? What happens if you don't comply? And who can have that role? It can't be the department or the ministry, because how can they monitor other ministries? Rural proofing has been, and Jane was obviously picking up on this, it's been critiqued a lot. And I think Jane talked about this too, that there's a big kind of emphasis on the process, very little emphasis on what is it we're trying to achieve. Its responsibility is short. People say it doesn't need to be rural proofed. Objectives are very unclear. What is the goal? What is it we want to achieve here? And often there's a poor evidence base. There's very few clear policy objectives. And I think Betty Ann was talking about this. It creates an urban-rural binary, this idea that you have uniform privilege in urban, uniform disadvantage in rural. And I see that Mark Shucksmith is on this call, and he and I were talking at an event on Tuesday evening about land renewed. And somebody spoke about food banks in a really poor part of Newcastle City. And rural proofing often leads us into this territory where we don't see the fact that rural isn't uniform. You have a lot of privilege, you have disadvantage in exactly the same way as you do in urban. So what are we saying about rural? We need to be clear what it is that is specific or particular to rural. In Northern Ireland, interestingly, there's a complete lack of confidence in the Rural Needs Act. People do not believe it's going to make rural be taken more seriously. There was a real concern that it confuses fiscal needs, that it's very easy to say, oh, you didn't rural proof, there are these rural issues. When the reality of politics is that you have a budget. So you actually need to have hard discussions about what it's possible to provide in sparsely populated areas. And there was also a concern that there's a very romantic idea of what our needs in rural areas, like keeping a bank open, was something that came up quite a lot. When the reality is, and I live in the city, I couldn't tell you the last time I was in a bank because I do online banking. And maybe it's about looking at different service provision. What's really needed is ensuring that everybody has the digital capacity and the skills to do internet banking, rather than having this kind of romantic idea of a different set of needs in rural areas. So I'm going to conclude by just saying, going forward, rural proofing is really messy and it's difficult. It's difficult at a member state level because it's across different government departments. And it's going to be really messy at European level because it's across different DGs, which of course is the whole point. You want everybody to be thinking about this. And who is going to monitor that? Will the Rural Observatory be the watchdog? I think it's really helpful to have somebody having an oversight. The Rural Community Network in Northern Ireland does that in a kind of voluntary capacity, and it has definitely helped just to raise it across different bodies. Good data is critical. How is that going to work? Will it be connected to the rural action plans in each of the member states? I think these are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about. And we need priorities. You know, if rural proofing is about everything, it very quickly becomes about nothing. So, and Jane and I talked about this in terms of the islands proofing bill in Scotland. You know, what are the priorities? Is it about digital connection? Is it about community support? What is it that we're looking for? And then I think we need to think about how we'll need different strategies for the different actors involved. So, you know, if we're looking at rural proofing policies, how do we consult with different stakeholders? If we're looking at rural proofing governance, what's the strategy there across DGs? How do they connect? If we're looking at rural services, how do we drill down to that spatial analysis? So I think we need different strategies for the different actors that are involved. So I'm going to stop there, and if people have questions or comments, I'm happy to hear and take those.